I know I say this a lot, but man, this is a good episode. This is definitely one of my favorites thus far. It's a rare thing that I comment on the directing in a Babylon 5 episode, but this is a good exception to that, and one of the few times which I look at the directing and say, yeah, that directing is awesome. Usually Babylon 5, at least for me, does not sit on its directing, it sits on its writing, sits on its acting, you know. These are the things that actually really flesh it out for me. But really good directing. There's some very high energy in this episode, and there's some great flow to the sequence of events. And I know that's partially due to the nature of it. It is literally an edited series of events because of the fact that we're watching a news broadcast of events that happened in B5. You know, it's the framing device. But it's very, very well done. Absolute props. It's a shame because I looked up the name of the gentleman who, or maybe possibly lady, who directed this and found a name and nothing else about them whatsoever. And it was nobody I'd heard of, and I couldn't find anything else. Like, I couldn't divine who this person was. So I got nothing, basically. So good job, person. So the second thing I want to talk about, you know, the other miscellaneous thing I want to talk about, is there's a whole lot of yawning. I'm so tired. There's a whole lot of miscellaneous world building in this episode. Obviously, we learn more about the Narn and the occupation. There's that great scene where Jakar talks about how his father accidentally spilled a drink on the woman who owned him, so she had him tortured to death in a fairly horrible, slow, drawn-out, agonizing death for dropping a drink. That says everything that needs to be said about that. I've made the comment before, maybe the Centauri were always horrible. I'm reminded of Dragon Age Origins. I know this is not unique, but one of the things I'm reminded strongly about that is Tyrion Logain and how he was basically insane in Dragon Age Origins. I've talked about this extensively. I don't want to cover all of that. But I don't mean insane as in I mean he was so damaged and so scarred by what happened to him under the occupation of the Orlesians that he couldn't function as a normal person anymore. He was incapable of it. And I'm reminded of that when it comes to the Narn. They have spent how long now constantly trying to do all the things that they're doing. So much of their culture only exists as it does because of the occupation, because of how they reacted to it, and because of how they forced the Centauri off-world. Remember, I don't think this has actually been discussed in the show yet, but we do know that the reason the Narn finally successfully got the Centauri off-world wasn't because they beat them, because they didn't. They didn't defeat them, they didn't successfully manage to bring down the Centauri oppressors. They just made it so expensive to maintain the occupation that the Centauri pulled out for the usual political reasons. I don't know if... I mean, that's not exactly what I'd call a resounding victory, but that says so much about the Narn ways. And then there's Londo's spin doctoring about the whole situation, and what's really messed up about his spin doctoring is it contains a disturbing amount of the truth. It's just the truth shined in a particular light, which once again shows why Londo is the experienced politician, why he actually is the person who should have the job he does. Despite the fact that it was originally given to him as a joke and an insult, he's a very qualified person for that, and we'll be seeing that in the future too. Londo is disturbingly good at being a politician, whether he likes it or not. Then there's the Psycor commercial. That was disturbing in its own right. I have a theory on the matter. Truly subliminal messages you're not really supposed to notice. That's hence the term subliminal. But the text that flashes on the screen, which I forget what it says exactly, but it's basically, you know, Psycor is your friend. Psycor, go Psycor. Psycor's the best. You know. I think I have a strong suspicion that was slowed down for our sake so we could see the subliminal message there. But even without the subliminal message, that entire commercial was just kind of just on this side of Uncanny Valley and just chilling enough to be like, Because obviously the commercial on the surface of it is designed to be like, hey, we're your friends and we're here to help you. You're different, but it's okay because we're going to take care of you. But think about what is said in that commercial without saying it. Notice how they knew he was a telepath. The implication is very clearly given there that there's no way you can hide being a telepath. That your friends are going to know, that your parents are going to know, and that Psycor is going to know. And because of that, there's no possibility of trying to avoid us, so don't even try. After all, we're here to take care of you. And a couple other little nuances in that commercial were very well done and very appropriately creepy. Very nice stuff there. Notice a couple other things, too. The way certain things are said, there's some very subtle stuff in this episode. Did you notice that there is now an Office of Public Information, which there wasn't before? Did you notice the comment about the new Ministry for Public Morale? What's that all about? Note how they describe the Mars colony. A human... shoot, I forget the exact wording. It's something like a human... It's the only colony that doesn't get along. It's, you know, they treat it as if it's some kind of weird outlier. All the other human colonies are totally cool with human interests. Why is Mars so weird? But then they say something like it's a human-owned area run by violent revolutionaries or something like that. There's a lot of very quiet, subtle things that go a long way to really starting to drive the hammer in as we start to understand just how bad things are getting at home. That's really, really made obvious, though. You know, all the subtle stuff goes away when Senator Idiot comes on the screen. I actually wrote down his name just so you guys know who I'm referring to. I'm referring to Senator Quattrell. But I'm going to keep calling him Senator Idiot because he is. Note what he says and how he says it. He implies that humans are superior to other races, that our affairs are more important than other affairs, that, you know, wars may happen, but at least they wouldn't happen in our backyard. He also implies that the Earthers right now, you know, the Earth Force Alliance, could actually hold their own against the Minbari. Against the Minbari. He implies that there is no concrete benefit from a station like Babylon 5. And then he completely contradicts that statement just like less than a minute later when he mentions how there are significant economic, political, and military gains to be had by Babylon 5's continued existence. This is what I usually refer to as a party man, or woman, the gender doesn't matter. Party person. Party person doesn't get across the same connotation. So I'm going to go back to my original statement. He's a party man. His only purpose is to toe the party line. Now, for those of you who don't actually know what I mean by that, I don't mean party as in, you know, twirling hats and lots of alcohol and pizza. What I mean by that is the party is the particular political entity that happens to be in charge of a given governmental body. And so the party line is that governmental body saying this is what is acceptable, this is what you can do, this is what you cannot do, and if you do anything other than this, you are wrong. Make sense? And then the idea of a party man is someone who toes the party line. Ergo, someone who looks at that and says, I will smile and nod and do whatever it is the party requests of me because I have no particular drive, ambition, morality, ethics, concepts, anything whatsoever to devise myself as an individual. My only purpose in existing is to try and keep my job. In other words, they're basically an empty suit, which is another way to refer to that as. Also notice that he, well, I'll get to that in just a moment. It is mentioned in this episode that the Narn are losing the war. It is dismissed as Centauri propaganda, but it makes me wonder, if the Narn are losing the war, why are they losing the war? I've actually brought this up before. Is it because of the help of Mr. Morden and his associates? Or were the Centauri always capable of beating back the Narn, and they just weren't because of a weak political infrastructure that was curtailing their military powerhouse capacities, etc., etc.? Now here's one for you. I mentioned subtlety. There's one line in this episode that helps to emphasize, as so many of the other things I've mentioned, how things have changed back at home. Former Senator Hidoshi. You remember him? He was a semi-recurring character earlier on in the show, and he was an avid supporter of Babylon 5, of cooperation with the aliens, and of the general... He was generally what we would call a good guy senator. While he certainly was still trying to work along with the party, he was someone who nevertheless clearly was a decent person underneath that. Former Senator Hidoshi. One last thing before I move on to my other two big points. Among the weapons that were noticed, that were found, that the Centauri were smuggling, were mass drivers. Mass drivers are probably one of the most horrifying weapons in space combat, in my opinion. They're not really at super weapon level. They're much, much more unpleasant than that. A mass driver is an extremely simple weapon in concept, although much harder to execute than you'd think, because, well, what a mass driver is taking a large amount of mass, like an asteroid or something, and flinging it at something at high velocity. Now, that sounds very simple, but moving that much mass that quickly and in that short distance is actually very, very difficult to do. It requires tremendous power, technology, and all sorts of other things to power it. It is a very complex machine to basically throw a rock at someone. The problem is the movement of mass and the displacement of energy created by movement of mass in simple physics, well, complicated physics actually, is one of the most devastating things that we know of. Put simply, have you seen Avengers 2? The Age of Ultron, that giant, that city that Ultron picked up in order to slam down onto the planet. Remember, that would have destroyed most life on the planet, if not all of it. That's what a mass driver does. It takes chunks of rock like that and just fires it at something at full velocity. Think about that for a moment. That's the kind of stuff the Centauri were smuggling. Next thing I want to talk about is politics. I've actually brought this up before recently, both from my perspective and from your perspective. The three types of politics, just to cover these again really, really quick. There's personal politics, large-scale politics, and boring politics. Now, the interesting thing here is, the reason this has been so recent in my mind is because people are asking me, what's one of the things that Episode 1 did wrong with regards to Star Wars, The Phantom Menace? And my response is usually, the obvious stuff that everyone else knows. But one person asked me, can you tell me anything that you haven't heard before about what was done wrong with it? And I said, absolutely. They did the wrong kind of politics. They did Type 3 politics, which is usually very boring. And yet, the entire premise of this episode is Type 3 politics. Now, the way they do this, the way they make... Because the whole premise of this episode is actually very simple. Budget. This is an episode about budget. About whether or not Babylon 5 should continue to be funded. That is the core premise of the episode. And this whole documentary they're showing is trying to analyze and disseminate the information in Babylon 5 to try and determine if it should stay on the air or not. Not on the air, not the show. Whether it should stay online or not. And yet they make that interesting by remembering the key crucial thing you need to remember when it comes to politics. Show the consequences of it. We see the consequences of Babylon 5 here. We see the consequences of personal politics in the way that we have, and stuff I'll talk about in a second, so I'll just leave that for later. We see the consequences of grand scale politics with regards to the war between the Narn and the Centauri, and how the humans are maneuvering between the two. We see the consequences of Type 3 politics, because this is about budgets and all sorts of little minor things that shouldn't actually even be a consideration, and yet it makes it all interesting by showing us the very real and very impacting consequence of all of that. Don't just show the boardroom. Don't just show the meeting of, okay, on the agenda is the... Show the people whose lives are changed by what happened in that meeting. Show the way that other companies react to the change in marketing strategy that was happened because of that meeting. Show how those budget changes affect the companies that rely on this company to stay in business, and so forth and so on. You show the impact. That's how you keep even the boring boardroom politics, the Type 3 politics, interesting. I actually don't have much else to say about that, honestly, because this episode just nails it. But this episode really, really, really nails all three forms of politics, especially the personal thing, which I'm just going to go ahead and jump into. What this episode does, and this is very smart, it shows more insight into characters by showing how they react. Now, some of this is not new. The Ivanova thing is a great example of something that's not new. If you don't know what I mean by that, so in my opinion, as someone who has analyzed people my whole life, ever since I was a child, you can tell more about someone in how they react to you than what they say or do. It's like this. The how they react, The what they do and then the what they say is, in my opinion, the tier of importance of how you can determine a person and figure out whatever it is you can about them. So in this episode, rather than showing the characters as if there's no camera on them, which is more or less the honest, the third-person perspective viewpoint, we see them with a camera on them, and some of them act differently and some of them don't, but all of them demonstrate aspects of themselves and their personality because a camera's on them. Because how they act is different because of whom they're acting with. In this case, in front of the camera for the news station. I've got a few notes about that I'm just going to dot down really quick. But the first one I wanted to hit right off the top of the bat is Delenn. Now, first of all, I don't like to cuss, and I'm not going to. I debated if I was going to or not on this one, but I really wanted to absolutely smack the unholy hell out of a reporter for everything she was saying. That is such an unacceptable behavior, what she did to Delenn. Ignoring the fact that I actually care about Delenn as a character and therefore feel protective of her, even if she was a total stranger, what the reporter did was completely unacceptable. And it's made worse because I understand Minbari culture. Someone putting someone else on the spot, asking leading and aggressive questions to try and provoke a response for the sake of ratings and for the sake of, intense journalism and whatever. That's kind of normal here in human culture. We're used to that. I've gotten that. Everyone's gotten that. It's standard, right? She's a Minbari. If another Minbari had done that to her, that would have been the most grievous of insults. That would have been the kind of thing you would do, like in human equivalent. That would basically be like spitting on someone's face. Physically spitting on their face. That's how insulting that is. And it also hits 2 points that really hurt Delenn personally. The war, and we know Delenn was involved in the war, and later on we learn more about that. So we know that that's a personal and private subject for her. And her transformation into a partial human, which has been part of her major character arc for the entire chunk of Season 2 thus far. And will continue to be in the future. So this is a very personal matter, on top of a very personal matter, both of which are very sensitive topics, and the reporter's being a goddamn bitch to her about it. I wanted to smack her. And yet we do learn about Delenn in the way she reacts, in the way she responds, how she says things. Garibaldi. Actually, let's do this in order. Let me rewind just a little bit. So I want to start with Franklin, because he's one of my favorites. Franklin doesn't give a damn. He does not give a good goddamn. He does not care about, opinions or politics or reporters. He is flatly, bluntly honest the entire time. And he also freely opens up about the story about the gentleman who died, basically just because of an accident, by being spaced. That was a touching and moving scene and really says a lot about Franklin as a character. Then there's Miss Ivanova, which is great. She, again, we don't learn much else about her, but this is very Ivanova. She flat out says, there's this, and here's the basic information about me, which is all the stuff that's on record, and if you want to learn more, and she flat out says, honestly, yes, there's more to me. And then she turns away. I love that. She doesn't lie. That's not her style. She just says, yes, there's more to me, and it's none of your damn business. Then we got Garibaldi. Now, he is a little more on the naive and the rambling side. Garibaldi actually just starts rambling about, my wishes and hopes for the future, and I wish this, and blah, blah, blah. And he says, and he is very, I would call it nervously honest in front of the camera, which again speaks to his character. Kosh is perfect. They see Kosh, and he closes the door without a word. You are not even worth acknowledging. Clank. Sheridan is, of course, Sheridan, and we do see he does have a little bit of a public face there, but at the same time, he really doesn't. Several times, he allows himself... I've paralleled Sheridan to Sisko, and I mean no intentional Deep Space Nine parallels, because both men, while they are very protocol, while they're very military, they're definitely the commanders of their in terms of mindset, in terms of concept. Both of them also have a very strong ethical and moral center. That trumps everything else. They will try to do things by the rules, and they'll try to do things right, but at the end of the day, that is actually put aside because they want to do what is right. And it's a kind of a tightrope walk that they're doing. And so we see in this episode Sheridan says things he probably shouldn't because he gets emotionally charged about them. Probably my favorite example of that is when he calls out people for armchair generaling. And I absolutely agree with that, by the way. His, the whole comments of, people think, oh, we could have won the war and blah, blah, blah. And he flat out says several times, oh, we could have won the war, or we haven't recovered from the war. In other words, stating without outright stating that we lost the war. Because we did, let's make that clear. And then it's the reporter who says, but we didn't lose the war. More of that propaganda involved, and so forth and so on. Is that it? Damn, I have like a whole page of notes, but I've kind of already gone through all of it. It's a really good episode. I highly recommend it. It's a great personal analysis piece. It's got some great politics, great energy, great tension, and it really makes you think. JMS himself, back when this episode was coming out, actually flat out said, if your friends haven't actually started watching Babylon 5 yet, this is a great time to start, and I kind of agree with that. The train's starting to move, and we'll see where it goes after this. For myself, I'll see you next time.